Tantor Audio presents The Cold Song by Linn Ullmann, translated by Barbara J. Haviland, narrated by Heather Wilds. 'Tis love that has warmed us. Jon Dreyer. Jenny Brodal had not had a drink in nearly 20 years. She opened a bottle of Cabernet and poured herself a large glass. She had imagined the warmth filtering down into her stomach, the tingling in her fingertips, but there was none of that. No warmth, no tingling, nothing. So she drained the glass and waited. Surely there would be something. Jenny looked at the open bottle on her bedside table. She had never said never. She had taken one day at a time, and never said never. She was in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of her large four-poster bed. Almost done now. She'd put on her makeup, she'd put on a dress. She still had on thick grey woolly socks, the ones that Alma had knitted. She looked at her feet. They looked twice as big in those socks, and they were still cold, despite the socks. There was also the lump on the side of her right big toe. She could feel it, sometimes red, sometimes purple, sometimes blue, and she dreaded taking off the socks and thrusting her feet into her slender, high-heeled sandals. She looked at the shoes, paired up like well-behaved children on the floor by her bed. Such pretty shoes. The colour of nectarines, from the 60s. She remembered the store where she had bought them. Jenny poured herself another glass. The trick was to get the wine right down to her feet. She had never said never. She had said one day at a time. For one, she would have to give a speech. There were other things, too. Jenny recalled a list of very good reasons she had given for not wanting to go through with this celebration, which was the word everyone kept insisting on using, and then she tried to remember why nobody had listened to her. Jenny stood up, twirled in front of the mirror on the wall. The black dress fit beautifully over her breasts, yes, and her cheeks flushed rather nicely, and everything was ready. Soon, after one more glass, she would take off her socks and put on the sandals. It was the 15th of July, 2008, and Jenny's 75th birthday. Myland, the big white mansion-like house where she had grown up after the war, was filled with flowers. She had lived in this house almost all her life, in good times and bad, and now 47 guests dressed in their summer finery were on their way here to salute her. 1. The treasure. Milla, or what was left of her, was found by Seaman and 2 of his friends when they were digging for buried treasure in the woods. They didn't know what it was they had found, but they knew it wasn't the treasure. It was the opposite of treasure. Later, when asked to explain to the police and their parents why they had been in the woods, Seaman found this hard to do. Why had they started digging in that particular clearing, under that particular tree? And what exactly had they been looking for? 2 years earlier, in July 2008, everyone had been out searching for Milla, far and wide, over land and sea, in ditches and trenches, in the sand hills out on the point and all around the forbidding cliffs, in the pile of rubble behind the old school, and in the empty, tumble-down houses at the end of Braga Road, where grass grew out of the windows and no child was allowed to go. Seaman remembered scouring every inch of town, thinking she might just be hiding somewhere waiting to be found, and that maybe, if he looked really hard, he'd be the one to find her. Everyone had searched for Milla, even the boy known as KB, the one who was later arrested and charged with her murder, searched for her, and for 2 years she had lain buried under that tree in the woods, unfound, covered by dirt and grass and moss and twigs and stones, until she had almost turned to dirt herself, all except for her skull and bits of bones and her teeth, and the long dark hair, which was no longer long and dark, but wispy and withered, as if it had been yanked up out of the ditch, roots and all. That summer, when she went missing, Seaman thought he saw her everywhere. She was the face in the shop window, the head bobbing in the waves, the long dark hair of some unknown woman fluttering in the breeze. Once Milla had looked at him and laughed. She had been real, like him, like his bike, but then she was a veil of night and frost that sometimes slipped through him and swept happiness away. He never forgot her. In the 2 years she lay buried, he'd think about her when he couldn't sleep, or when autumn was coming and the air smelled of cordite, damp and withered leaves. But at some point he had stopped looking for her, and no longer believed that he would be the one to find her. Seaman was the youngest of the 3 boys. The other 2 were Gunnar and Christian. It was a Saturday at the end of October 2010, and the 3 friends were spending one last weekend together. The time had come to close down the summer houses for the winter, and for their little seaside town, a couple of hours south of Oslo, to curl in on its own darkness. It was afternoon, not quite 5 o'clock. The light was already beginning to fade, and the boys had decided to locate and dig up a treasure they had buried some months earlier. Gunnar and Christian couldn't see the point in leaving it in the ground forever. Seaman didn't agree. As far as he was concerned, that was exactly the point. That was what made it treasure. It was concealed from everyone except them, and was 1,000 times more valuable in the ground than above the ground. He couldn't explain why. He just knew that's how it was, but neither Gunnar nor Christian even tried to understand what Seaman was talking about. They just thought he was being a fool. They wanted their stuff back, their contributions, their part of the treasure. They really didn't give a shit about the treasure as treasure, so eventually Seaman said it was fine by him. Why didn't they just go out there in the forest right now and dig it up? He didn't care. The story of the treasure had begun some months earlier, in August 2010, when Gunnar, the eldest of the 3 friends, suggested that they become blood brothers. The light was warm and red, and everything in that small town was lusher than ever on this particular evening, as things tend to be when summer is almost over. Soon they would be going their separate ways, back to the city where they lived far apart and called other boys their friends. Gunnar had taken a deep breath and said, "Mixing blood is a symbol of eternal friendship." The other 2 boys had balked at this. The thought of slashing the skin of your palm with a piece of glass from a broken Coca-Cola bottle was not something you would want to do, not even in the interest of eternal friendship, and even if you were mainly given to kicking a soccer ball about and using your legs, you did actually need your hands too. Seaman tried to say this, but couldn't find the right words. Needed them for all sorts of things, without bloody cuts and scratches. But how did you tell Gunnar without ruining everything, without being accused of being a coward? They were sitting on the deck outside their secret cottage in the woods, the one they had built the previous summer. They had lit a fire and grilled hot dogs, eaten chips, and had some Coke. They were all Liverpool fans, so they had plenty to talk about. They sang songs too, because there was no one there to hear them. Walk on, with hope in your heart. And Seaman had thought to himself that when you sang that song you felt like your life really was about to begin. But then Gunnar, and this was typical Gunnar, had started talking about how just because they spent their summers together, that didn't necessarily mean they were true friends. True friends who were there for each other through thick and thin. Gunnar knew a guy who had supported Liverpool for years, and then he had suddenly switched to Manchester United just because his new neighbour was a fan of Manchester United. And what the fuck do you do with a guy like that? Is that a true friend? and Gunnar had launched into a long and complicated speech about blood and pain and true friendship, and other things he had obviously been thinking a lot about over the summer, concluding with this very dramatic idea that they become blood brothers. He had come prepared, had it all planned out. That, too, was just like Gunnar. The bits of broken glass were neatly wrapped in tinfoil. He had broken the bottle in the backyard at home, and then washed the shards with dishwashing liquid because, said Gunnar, if you cut your hand with a dirty bit of broken glass, you might die. You might get blood poisoning and die. And he had placed the lumpy little package between them in the sunlight, and carefully folded back the foil, as if it were diamonds he had in there, or scorpions. And that was the moment when Christian came up with the idea of burying treasure instead, as a symbol of true and everlasting friendship. It was simple. All three of them would have to offer up one thing, and that thing had to be precious. It had to be a sacrifice. No mingling of blood, no cuts or grazes, but stuff, valuable stuff, buried deep in the ground as a symbol of their commitment to each other, to friendship, and to Liverpool FC. They counted steps. When not on their bikes, they counted steps, from Simon's house to Gunnar's house, from Gunnar's house to Christian's house, from Christian's house to Simon's house, from the top of the road, where Jenny Brodal's house, old and ghostly white, hovered just above the ground, to the bottom of the road, where Simon's parents' summer cottage lay partly hidden by a worn blue picket fence. In Christian's parents' garden, located just 60 steps from Jenny Brodal's house, and 452 steps from Simon's parents' cottage, there was a shed. In the shed, there was an old light blue tin pail, with a lid that Christian's mother had picked up in a second-hand shop some years earlier. The pail was dented. It had sun-bleached, hand-painted pictures of cows and pretty milkmaids on it, and on one side the words, milk, nature's most nearly perfect food. Christian told Simon and Gunnar how his father had been mad all day because of that pail. His father couldn't see the sense in spending 200 kroner on something so stupid. And then Christian's mother had gotten twice as mad and said, well, if his father had just built that terrace out from their bedroom door, as he'd been promising to do for years, she could have dressed it up with troughs and pots and climbing roses and cushions and throws. And she would put flowers in the pail. They could have their own little Italian veranda. What the fuck is an Italian veranda? Christian's father had said then. I don't know what an Italian veranda is, Christian said. And Simon and Gunnar had nodded, meaning they didn't know either, but they got the idea. They all had parents with stuff going on. The tin pail had been part of Christian's mother's great plan, but the terrace, Italian or otherwise, did not get built. Not that year, and not the year after either. So now the pail was tucked away at the back of the shed, partly hidden behind a broken lawnmower. The pail can be our treasure chest, Christian said. The point in burying treasure was never to unearth it. Never. You know it's there. You know where it is. You know how many steps you have to walk to get there, or how many minutes it takes on your bike. You know how precious it is, and how much you sacrificed when you chose to bury it, and never see it again. And you can never speak of it to anyone, ever. But, said Simon, Christian had to come up with something to put in the pail, too. Christian had to make a sacrifice. Simon felt uncomfortable uttering that word, sacrifice. It was a stupid word. Something a girl might say, or a woman, not an 11-year-old boy. Uttering it made him think of Alma, Jenny Brodal's weird black-haired granddaughter, and how she, a few years earlier, had asked him into her room, told him to bend over, and then proceeded to brush his hair, one long stroke after the other. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 strokes. She went on brushing forever, her weird little voice counting every stroke. "So that your hair will shine," she'd said. "And for this you must make sacrifices." So that his hair would fucking shine. "Brush your own hair," he had said when she wanted to do it again the next day, and she had said no. His hair was way longer than hers and shone more beautifully, and he, stupid little boy, had bent over and let her do it again. Anyway, the pail itself wasn't a sacrifice, Seaman said. Hadn't Christian's grandmother just given him 250 kroner? He ought to offer up at least 200 of that. Gunnar nodded and made a mumbling sound indicating that he agreed with Seaman. But no, Christian didn't want to give up his money, even though the treasure had been his idea, and he was the one who had said that their offerings all had to be valuable, precious, priceless. Yes, he had used all those words, and even though he was the one who said they had to make a sacrifice, Seaman and Gunnar both felt it wasn't enough to say that the tin pail itself was his contribution to the treasure. That wasn't a sacrifice. The pail wasn't a part of the treasure. The pail was the treasure chest. Only it wasn't a chest. It was a pail. If the truth be told, and, as Gunnar pointed out, this was the moment of truth, Christian didn't have anything of value except the money from his grandmother. "This is not a game," Seaman said. "Well, it's kind of a game," Christian retorted, knowing already that he had to give up the money. "So, okay, take it," he said. And when it came to Gunnar, there was no doubt what his offering ought to be. On this point, Seaman and Christian were in complete agreement. Gunnar had to sacrifice his Liverpool FC autograph book. A few months earlier, Gunnar had been to Liverpool with his big brother, who was 22. They had spent a whole weekend there, stayed in a hotel, and gone to see a Champions League match between Liverpool and Tottenham. Gunnar's big brother wasn't a real big brother, even though Gunnar was always going on about my big brother this and my big brother that. Gunnar's big brother was only a half-brother. He was Gunnar's father's son from an earlier marriage, and Gunnar didn't really see him all that often. Gunnar's father was a dentist. So was his mother. They had bought a summer house just down the street from Jenny Brodal's house. Gunnar's big brother was not really around that much. He was a grown-up and had his own life. Seaman and Christian had seen him only once, the previous summer, when Gunnar had pointed him out. But that's how it was with Gunnar's family members. Seaman and Christian hadn't actually met any of them. Rather, they had been pointed out. "See, there's my big brother drinking beer with his friends, and there's my father going out for a run again, and there's my mother in her garden. My father has no idea she's doing it with weird Alma's father right under his nose. And there are our dogs. They are my father's dogs, really, not like regular family dogs that you hang out with. They either lie very still in the backyard or go running with my father." Stephen Gerrard, Fernando Torres, and Jamie Carragher were just some of the players who had signed their names in Gunnar's autograph book. But that was not the autograph book's most precious feature. Seaman knew that. Carefully glued to the last page was a photograph of Gunnar and his big brother outside Anfield Stadium. They were both wearing Liverpool scarves, and his big brother was almost 6'6", with broad shoulders and long brown hair falling over his face. Gunnar looked like a real daddy longlegs next to him. Under the picture in blue biro were the words, "To the world's greatest little brother. Some people believe soccer is a matter of life and death. You and I know that it is much more important than that." Seaman knew that Gunnar didn't want to put the autograph book in the pail. The 200 kroner from Christian's grandmother was one thing. Gunnar's Liverpool autograph book was quite another. Forcing him to part with it was maybe asking too much, thought Seaman. Christian's grandmother gave her grandson money all the time. But Gunnar's big brother hardly ever, or rather never, apart from this once, took Gunnar to Liverpool to see a Champions League match. And how often did you get a chance to collect Steven Gerrard's, Fernando Torres and Jamie Carragher's autographs? Gunnar, who was the skinniest of the three, and whose family members were only pointed out, and whose mother was doing it with weird Alma's father, had been close to tears when he promised the other two that he would offer up the autograph book, and Simon almost said, "Let's just forget about the whole thing." But he didn't. Instead, he said, "I know what I'm putting in the pail." He was the only one left, and he wanted to show Gunnar and Christian that he too was prepared to make a sacrifice. "Bend over and I'll make your hair shine." Simon's mother had a small gold chain with a little diamond crucifix on it. His father had given it to her for Christmas 2.5 years ago. Simon had gone with him to the jeweller's to buy it, and had almost passed out when he heard how many thousands it cost. It was supposed to be partly from him too, and it was supposed to make his mother really happy. He didn't know if it had worked, paying all those thousands to make his mother happy. His mother was the same after Christmas as she had been before Christmas. Simon had wondered whether to ask his father if it had been worth it, but he didn't. And now he had this whole other idea. Every night, before his mother went to bed, she took off the necklace and put it in a blue bowl in the bathroom. He just had to wait until everyone was asleep. It would be the easiest thing in the world. No one would suspect him. Simon was not the kind of kid who stole stuff. His mother would be upset. She would turn the whole summer house upside down searching for her diamond necklace, but she would never suspect him. Gunnar and Christian stared at each other, and then at Simon. "How much did it cost exactly?" Christian asked. "Thousands. 17, maybe." "Shut up," said Christian. "You're lying." "Well, if they're real diamonds," Gunnar said, "then it's possible. Diamonds are very expensive." Christian considered this. "Okay, then," he said, fixing his eyes on Simon. "You get that necklace." The following evening they combed the woods, raced their bikes along the narrow, winding woodland tracks under the bright treetops, looking for the perfect spot in which to bury the pail. They rode past the green forest lake where years and years ago 2 little children had drowned. It was Alma from up the road at Myland, exactly 567 steps from Simon's house, who had told Simon about the drowning in the woods. Alma was a few years older than Simon, and had occasionally been paid by his mother to look after him for an hour or two. That was years ago, though. He looked after himself now, but a long time ago, before he even knew Gunnar and Christian, when he was little, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. He was 11 now. When Simon grew up and had children, he would never pay girls like Alma to look after them. Under no circumstances would he leave his future children with someone like her, not even for free. She was weird, and dark-eyed, and treated him like a doll, and told stories, some true, some not, and he could never be sure which were which. The story about the children drowning in the Green Lake was probably true, he thought. Most of it, anyway. The boy had drowned while the girl watched, and the mother of the 2 children had been so stricken with grief that she snatched the girl from her bed and drowned her as well. "She must have loved the son more than the daughter," whispered Alma. Alma and Simon on the edge of the lake, gazing across the sun-warmed water, each clutching a slice of apple cake and a plastic cup of red lemonade. It was Alma's mother who had packed them a lunch, but Alma didn't like red lemonade, so she tipped it all into the lake. Alma's mother's name was Siri. She had a habit of stroking Simon's hair, saying, "Hi, Simon, how are you today?" Alma continued, in that whispering voice of hers, to tell her story. "The little boy fell into the water and drowned, while his sister just stood there and watched. And when the girl came home without her little brother, her mother didn't know what to do with herself. She cried, and cried, and cried, and no one could stay in the house because of all the crying. The girl put her hands over her ears and cried too, but her mother didn't care. Or maybe she did care, but she didn't listen. Then one night the mother went very quiet, and then the girl went very quiet too. "What happened?" Seaman asked. "Did the mother become happy again and stop crying?" Alma thought for a moment. "No, not exactly," she said. "The mother took the girl into her big four-poster bed, and read and sang to her, and tickled the back of her neck, and ruffled her hair, and said, 'I love you so much, my little... Alma searched for a word. "Little song thrush," suggested Seaman, because that was what his mother called him. "Little song thrush, yes. I love you so much, my little song thrush," the mother told the girl. Then she got out of bed and went to the kitchen and made a big cup of hot cocoa, which was the girl's favorite. Alma turned to Seaman. He had been 8 years old that day, when they sat at the edge of the green lake eating apple cake. "It's your mother, isn't it? It's your mother who calls you little song thrush," Alma said. Seaman didn't answer. "Why does she call you little song thrush?" Alma asked. "I don't know," said Seaman, who was wishing he had kept his mouth shut. He didn't want to tell her anything at all about himself, and certainly not this. He didn't want to say, "Because every night before Mama kisses me good night and leaves my room, she whispers, 'What would you like me to sing to you before I go?' And then I whisper back, 'I want you to sing Little Song Thrush, all the verses.' That's why Mama calls me Little Song Thrush." Alma turned to face the water again, and continued with her story. "And once the mother had made the cocoa, she poured a sleeping potion into the cup. It was colorless, tasteless. There are such things, you know, sleeping potions that you can drink without even realizing that you're drinking them. You never know. It can happen any time. It could happen to you, too. Your mother could put a sleeping potion into your cocoa without you knowing." "Cut it out," said Seaman. "You cut it out," said Alma. "I'm only telling you that it could happen. These are the harsh realities of life." "Well, cut it out anyway," Seaman said again. "And once the girl had drunk the cocoa," Alma went on, "she fell asleep in her mother's big four-poster bed, fell into a deep, deep sleep. And the mother put her ear to the girl's mouth, and when she was sure that she wouldn't wake up, she picked her up in her arms and carried her through the woods to this lake, and threw her in." "I don't believe that," Seaman said. "That's because you're a little boy," Alma said, "and because you don't know what mothers do when they can't stop crying. And that girl's mother just couldn't stop crying." It was years now since Alma had looked after Seaman and told him the story about the boy and the girl who had drowned in the green lake, and even though he didn't believe the story 100%, he didn't like to swim there. He swam in the sea instead. He never wanted to swim in those green waters, thinking about how that boy and girl turned to water lilies might clutch at him, a foot or an arm, and pull him under. So Seaman and his friends rowed past the lake where he had sat with Alma when he was little, and he thought to himself, "I know every inch of this forest." The treasure, 200 kroner in notes, a diamond crucifix on a gold chain, and an autograph book from Liverpool was in the light blue tin pail, lashed to Christian's handlebars. One shovel jutted out of Gunnar's rucksack. Seaman had borrowed a saddlebag and found room for the other shovel in that. 3 boys, all fine as pencil strokes, riding full tilt to the dim green light, on the hunt for the perfect hiding place.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?